My name is Keisha. I am 29 years old, and I have spent my entire life trying to fill a void that was never meant for me. Right now, I am sitting in my own living room in Atlanta, surrounded by the life I built with my own two hands, but my mind is racing back to that fateful night. The camera tracks slowly as I settle into my seat, catching the steady fire in my eyes so you can see the resilience behind the pain. My father just bought a multi-million-dollar yacht while I was on the verge of losing my left leg forever. That is not a metaphor. That is the cold, hard reality of my bloodline. Before I dive into this betrayal, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had family turn their backs on you when you were at your lowest, hit subscribe and like this video to help spread the strength. My family worshipped appearances and wealth above all else. We were the poster children for African American success in Georgia with lavish parties and custom designer suits. But behind that golden veil was a chill that no fireplace in their mansion could ever warm. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday. A drunk driver slammed into my car, crushing my left leg. The doctors told me I needed an urgent $8,000 surgery to save the nerves or necrosis would set in within days. $8,000. A rounding error for my parents, but my entire existence at the time. When I limped into my father's yacht launch party, I actually thought blood would be thicker than greed. I was wrong. The camera follows my every move as I sit on my high-end leather sofa, shadows stretching across my face, preparing to tell you about the moment I realized I was a stranger in my own home. That night, the air was thick with the scent of salt water and expensive cologne. My father, Marcus, stood on the deck with a glass of vintage wine beaming at his business partners. He saw me hobbling on crutches, face pale with agony, but there was no worry in his eyes. Instead of asking if I was okay, he scowled at my old metal crutches because they were scratching the expensive teak flooring of his new toy. My mother, Yolanda, stepped forward not to hug me, but to adjust her silk scarf, looking at me like I was a stain on a perfect painting. I tried to keep my voice steady, handing them the white medical folder I had gripped so hard it was wrinkled. I told them this was my last chance to ever walk normally again. But their reaction changed my life forever, a jolt of electricity that I can still feel in my bones today. Marcus, swirling his drink as the condensation dripped onto the teak deck, remains burned into my mind. I stood there leaning heavily on my crutches, feeling the sharp rhythmic throbbing in my left leg that signaled the dying nerves. The festive music from the yacht's sound system felt like a mockery. I held out the envelope containing my medical reports, my hands trembling not just from the pain, but from the sheer vulnerability of asking for help. Marcus didn't even reach for it. He just glanced at the hospital logo and let out a long, weary sigh, as if my medical emergency was an inconvenient bill he had already decided to ignore. "Keisha, we are celebrating a milestone today," he said, his voice booming with that practiced authority he used in boardrooms. "This yacht represents our family's arrival at the peak of Atlanta's elite. And here you are bringing this dark cloud over $1 million moment." I tried to explain that the surgery was time-sensitive, that the $8,000 was the difference between walking and a wheelchair, but he just gestured to the sprawling harbor around us. "Look at this vessel, Keisha. This is a legacy. I cannot compromise the image of this family because you decided to pursue a hobby instead of a career. If you had listened to me and joined the firm, you would have a corner office and platinum insurance. But you wanted to be an artist. You wanted the freelance life. Well, the freelance life means you handle your own disasters." He spoke about my passion for design as if it were a childhood phase I had stubbornly refused to outgrow. To him, my sketches and digital branding contracts weren't real work. They were just excuses to be lazy, and now he felt I was asking him to subsidize my failure. The humiliation deepened as his business associates began to drift closer, curious about the commotion. Marcus didn't lower his voice. In fact, he seemed to use me as a prop to demonstrate his tough love philosophy. He told a partner from the bank that I was a prime example of why the younger generation was failing. They want the freedom without the foundation. He chuckled while I stood there feeling the blood pool in my injured limb. He told me that giving me the money would be a disservice to my character. It would prevent me from hitting rock bottom, which he claimed was the only place I would ever learn the value of a dollar. $8,000 was less than the cost of the catering for that single night, yet he spoke as if I were asking for his entire empire. He looked me dead in the eye and said that my inability to pay for my own surgery was proof that my life's work was worthless. According to my father, if the world didn't pay me enough to save my own leg, then the leg wasn't worth saving. I realized then that in his house you only earned the right to be healthy if you were wealthy enough to afford it. He turned his back on me to toast to his new boat, leaving me to limp toward the gangplank, while the guests whispered behind their hands. The man who had taught me to walk was now perfectly comfortable watching me lose that ability forever. As Marcus turned his back on me, his laughter blending with the clinking of crystal glasses, I looked toward my mother, Yolanda. She was standing near the railing, her posture as stiff and unyielding as the diamonds around her neck. I reached out a hand hoping to find a flicker of the maternal instinct that surely existed somewhere beneath her tailored silk dress. "Mother, please." I whispered, the pain in my leg now a white-hot roar that made the world tilt. "You know I've worked 3 jobs just to keep my studio open. I just need a chance to heal." Yolanda didn't move toward me. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her drink and looked at me with a cold, analytical gaze that made me feel like a stranger. "Keisha," she began, her voice smooth and devoid of any warmth, "your father is right. We have watched you chase this artistic dream of yours while ignoring every stable path we tried to set for you. You wanted to be independent, didn't you? You wanted to prove that you didn't need the family firm." She stepped closer, but only to straighten the collar of my jacket, with a sharp, dismissive tug. "Life has a way of teaching the lessons that parents cannot. This injury is not a tragedy, it is a consequence. It is a physical manifestation of your lack of preparation. If we pay for this surgery, we are simply enabling your continued failure to plan for your own future. A limp Keisha will be a daily reminder of why stability matters. It will teach you the responsibility that a paycheck and a proper insurance plan would have provided." She spoke as if my suffering were an educational tool, a convenient disciplinary measure sent by the universe to correct my career choices. I watched her eyes searching for a trace of the woman who used to bandage my scraped knees when I was a child, but she was gone. In her place was a woman who valued the family's prestige and the narrative of self-made success more than her daughter's ability to walk. She told me that by refusing the money, she was actually doing me a favor. She called it tough love, a term she used to camouflage her utter lack of empathy. "You will find a way, or you won't," she said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper so the nearby guests wouldn't hear. "But you will not embarrass us by playing the victim at your father's celebration. If you cannot afford your own life, then perhaps you should reconsider the life you chose." I realized then that my mother didn't see a daughter in pain. She saw a flawed investment that was demanding more capital. She was more concerned about me ruining the aesthetic of the party than the fact that her child's tissue was dying. She adjusted her scarf one last time and walked away to join a group of socialites, leaving me standing there on the vibrating deck of a boat that cost more than my life. The realization hit me harder than the accident itself. To my mother, my value was tied to my utility, and a broken daughter was simply a broken tool she no longer had any use for. I was alone in a crowd of my own blood, and for the first time, the coldness of the Atlantic Ocean felt warmer than my mother's heart. Tiffany stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the deck as she adjusted the heavy diamond pendant resting on her chest. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, the kind of expression one might give a stray dog that had wandered into a 5-star restaurant. She didn't share my blood, but she had perfectly mastered my family's language of exclusion. "Keisha, honey." She began, her voice dripping with a fake honeyed sweetness that felt like sandpaper. "It is truly exhausting to see you like this. We are all trying to have a meaningful night celebrating your parents' incredible success, and you show up like a ghost from a tragedy movie. She turned to the small circle of guests, her eyes searching for their agreement, before landing back on me. In this country, especially in our circles, personal health is a reflection of personal discipline. She continued, tilting her head. If you had chosen a path with a real company, a real career, you would have the kind of premium insurance that handles things like this without needing to beg. But you wanted to be an artist. You wanted the aesthetic of the struggling creator, and now you are upset that the struggle is actually painful. It is not your parents' job to be your safety net for every poor life choice you make. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that was devoid of any humor. It is quite manipulative, don't you think, showing up here on crutches at this specific moment? It feels less like a medical emergency and more like emotional blackmail. You are trying to make everyone feel guilty for their prosperity just because you haven't managed to secure your own. I tried to speak to tell her that an accident isn't a choice, that I had been working 80 hours a week just to stay afloat. But she held up a perfectly manicured hand to silence me. Let's be honest, Keisha. You have always been the one who wanted special treatment. You use your struggles like a weapon to draw attention away from everyone else's achievements. We are here to toast a multi-million-dollar vessel, a symbol of what hard work actually looks like, and you are holding out a hospital bill like it's a trophy. It's tacky, it's selfish, and frankly, it's insulting to the dignity of this family. She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the metallic smell of the harbor. You aren't asking for a loan, you are asking for a handout to cover up your lack of responsibility. If you were truly a professional, you would have had your affairs in order. Instead, you are acting like a child who broke a toy and expects her parents to buy a new one. Before I could even respond, she turned her back on me gracefully, waving over a waiter for another glass of champagne, having dismissed my entire existence as nothing more than an inconvenient social faux pas. I stood there, the weight of her words sinking in, realizing that in my family's world, being poor was a sin, and being injured without a plan was a crime that deserved no mercy. Marcus looked me straight in the eye as the harbor lights danced off the gold watch on his wrist, a watch that cost 3 times the surgery I was begging for. He didn't even touch the medical folder I held out. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his vintage scotch, his expression shifting from celebratory to deeply annoyed. Keisha, we are at a turning point for this family's legacy, he said, his voice carrying over the music, so his associates could hear his firm stance. This yacht is a symbol of everything I have built from nothing. It is about prestige and progress. And here you are, limping into this moment like a debt collector from a life you chose to live outside of my protection. I tried to tell him the doctors were worried about permanent nerve damage, but he held up a hand to silence me. You wanted to be a freelance artist, Keisha. You wanted the freedom to not have a boss, to not have a schedule, and apparently, to not have a real insurance plan. That was your choice. Now you're asking me to liquidate family assets to subsidize your lack of foresight. It's not just about the $8,000, it's about the principle. If I give you this money, I am telling the world that I support your mediocre lifestyle. I am telling you that you don't have to grow up. He leaned in closer, his scent of expensive tobacco and salt air hitting me like a physical blow. A real professional handles their own disasters. If your art was as valuable as you claim, you'd have the money. The fact that you don't is proof that you are failing, and I do not invest in failure. The crowd of Atlanta's elite black upper class began to go quiet, watching the scene unfold. Marcus didn't lower his voice. He used the moment to lecture me like a courtroom judge. He told his friends that the biggest problem with my generation was the expectation of a soft landing without putting in the hard work. He laughed, calling my situation a self-inflicted wound. He said that giving me the money would be a disservice to my character, that I needed to feel the weight of my own poor decisions to finally learn how the world works. $8,000 was less than he spent on the fireworks display scheduled for later that night, yet he spoke as if I were asking for the keys to his kingdom. He looked at my injured leg with a cold, detached curiosity. then told me that if the market didn't think my work was worth enough to save my leg, then he wasn't going to argue with the market. He turned his back on me, raising his glass to a group of developers, dismissing me as if I were nothing more than a broken piece of equipment that was no longer his responsibility. I stood there, the pain in my leg screaming, realizing that my father's love was a currency he only spent on things that increased his net worth. I wasn't an investment anymore. I was a liability he was ready to write off. The rain began to fall just as the security guard placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, professional, yet completely devoid of empathy. My father, Marcus, had given the nod, and just like that, I was no longer a daughter. I was a disturbance to be cleared away. I tried to find my balance on my crutches, the metal slipping on the wet teak deck, but the guard didn't wait. He began to usher me toward the gangplank, his movements forcing me to move faster than my injured leg could handle. Every step sent a fresh wave of agony through my hip, a sharp reminder that the nerves were screaming for a surgery my own blood had just denied me. I looked back one last time, hoping to see a change of heart, a moment of regret on my mother's face, or a flicker of guilt in Andre's eyes. But all I saw was the golden glow of the yacht's cabin, where they were already laughing and clinking glasses with their elite guests. To them, I was already gone. I was just a ghost they had successfully exorcised from their perfect, wealthy lives. As I reached the pier, the guard stepped back and watched me with a cold, detached gaze. The heavy iron gates of the private marina clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing like a final judgment. I stood there on the pavement of Atlanta's most exclusive harbor, the rain soaking through my thin jacket and chilling me to the bone. The contrast was devastating. Behind the gates lay a world of million-dollar vessels, vintage scotch, and the people who claimed to love me. On my side of the gate was the dark, wet street, and the crushing weight of an $8,000 debt I had no way to pay. I tried to reach for my phone, my fingers trembling and numb from the cold. I looked at the screen hoping for a miracle, but my father's name was gone from my contacts. He hadn't just refused to help, he had blocked me. My mother had blocked me. Even Andre, my own brother, had wiped me from his digital life as easily as he had dismissed me on the boat. The physical pain in my leg began to blend with the emotional trauma, creating a suffocating pressure in my chest. I sank down onto a cold concrete bench near the bus stop, my crutches clattering to the ground. I realized then that in the eyes of the people who raised me, my value was purely transactional. Because I had chosen art over a corporate desk, because I had chosen freedom over their rigid expectations, I had forfeited my right to their protection. I was a Black woman in America who had been told her entire life that family was the only true safety net. Yet here I was, falling through the massive holes they had intentionally torn in that net. The silence of the night was only broken by the distant sound of the yacht's party and the relentless rhythm of the rain. I felt small, invisible, and completely broken. I looked at my swollen, bruised leg and wondered if this was where my journey ended, on a wet bench discarded like trash by the people who shared my DNA. The darkness felt absolute, a void that was swallowing my hope and my future whole. The rain began to fall heavily just as the security guard placed a rough hand on my shoulder. That grip was stiff and professional, but completely lacked any trace of human warmth. My father, Marcus, only needed to give a slight nod, and just like that, I was no longer a daughter. I was merely a nuisance that needed to be scrubbed away. I struggled to maintain my balance on my crutches as the metal tips slipped on the wet teak deck of the luxury yacht. But the guard did not wait. He began leading me toward the gangplank with forceful movements that made me move faster than my injured leg could handle. Every step sent a wave of intense agony through my hip. It was a cold reminder that my nerves were screaming for a surgery that my own blood had just denied me. I turned my head to look back one last time, hoping to see a change of heart or a moment of regret on my mother's face. I looked for even a hint of guilt in Andre's eyes. But all I saw was the brilliant golden light glowing from the luxury cabin where they were already laughing and clinking glasses with their elite guests. To them, I had already vanished. I was just a ghost they had successfully banished from their perfect wealthy lives. As I reached the pier, the guard stepped back and watched me with a cold and distant gaze. The heavy iron gates of the private marina slammed shut behind me, and that sound echoed like a final judgment. I stood there on the sidewalk of the most exclusive harbor in Atlanta, with the rain soaking through my thin jacket and chilling me to the bone. The contrast was devastating. Behind those gates lay a world of million-dollar ships and aged scotch, and the people who once claimed to love me. On this side of the gate was the dark, wet street, and the crushing weight of an $8,000 debt that I had no way to pay. I tried to reach for my phone with fingers that were trembling and numb from the cold. I looked at the screen hoping for a miracle, but my father's name was gone from my contacts. He had not just refused to help, he had blocked me. My mother had blocked me. Even Andre, my own brother, had erased me from his digital life as easily as he had dismissed me on the boat. The physical pain in my leg began to merge with the psychological shock, creating a suffocating pressure in my chest. I collapsed onto a cold stone bench near the bus stop, and my crutches clattered loudly onto the ground. I realized then that in the eyes of the people who raised me, my value was purely transactional. Because I had chosen art over a corporate desk, and because I chose freedom over their rigid expectations, I had lost the right to their protection. I am a Black woman in America who was taught her whole life that family was the only true safety net, yet here I was, falling through the massive holes they had intentionally torn in that net. The silence of the night was only broken by the distant music from the yacht party and the relentless rhythm of the rain. I felt so small and invisible and completely broken. I looked at my swollen, bruised leg and wondered if this was where my journey ended, on a wet bench discarded like trash by the people who shared my DNA. The darkness surrounded me like a void, swallowing my hope and my entire future. I gripped my phone with frozen fingers. The screen cracked from the fall on the pier as the cold rain blurred my vision. This was the final threshold. I had always been the black sheep, the one who chose canvases over spreadsheets, but I never believed they would actually let me break. I scrolled to my father's name, Marcus, and pressed call. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate rhythm of hope fighting against the reality of the last hour. Instead of his deep, booming voice, I was met with a flat, mechanical tone. "The number you are calling is not available." I tried again, then a third time, the realization sinking in like lead in my stomach. He hadn't just hung up. He had blocked me. My own father had erased my existence while I was still standing in the wreckage of my life. I wiped the water from my eyes and tried my mother, Yolanda. She was always the one who smoothed things over, the one who maintained the family image. Surely she wouldn't let her daughter lose a limb over a bruised ego. I pressed the icon and waited. 1 ring, 2 rings. Then the same soul-crushing silence. The line was dead. I was staring at a screen filled with the ghosts of people who were supposed to be my sanctuary. My thumb hovered over Andre's name, my big brother, the one I used to play with in the backyard of our old house in Cascade Heights. I hit dial, praying for a shred of humanity. Nothing. The call didn't even go through. It was a digital execution. They had met in a huddle on that $1 million yacht and decided as a unit to cut the cord. The desperation reached a peak that felt like physical suffocation. I was a 30-year-old woman with a dying leg sitting on a wet bench in the middle of the night, and I had been officially deleted by my own bloodline. The $8,000 was no longer just a medical fee. It was the price of my admission into their hearts, and I was short on cash. I screamed into the rain, a sound that was swallowed by the wind and the distant music still drifting from the harbor. I felt a terrifying sense of invisibility. If I died right here on this street, they wouldn't even get the notification because they had closed the gates on me. The isolation of being a successful, educated Black woman who had been discarded by her own affluent community was a special kind of hell. You are taught that your people are your strength, but my people had just used their strength to push me into the abyss. I looked at my phone one last time, the battery hovering at 5%, reflecting the dying embers of my hope. There was no one else. No trust funds, no secret accounts, just the throbbing agony in my leg, and the cold reality that I was truly alone. I had reached the absolute bottom of the pit, staring up at a sky that offered no mercy. I realized then that the Keisha who sought their approval had to die tonight because that woman was never going to survive the walk home. I threw the medical folder into a nearby trash can, watching the rain soak the papers that proved I was in trouble. If I was going to save myself, I couldn't do it as their daughter anymore. I was just a woman with a broken body and a heart that was turning into flint. The absolute peak of my despair was the exact moment I stopped waiting for a savior and started looking for a weapon. I stood up, leaning on my crutches, with a grim determination, knowing that the bridge back to that yacht hadn't just been burned. It had been bombed. I limped into my apartment, the sound of the heavy rain outside still drumming against the thin, cracked window panes of my unit in one of Atlanta's forgotten corners. The contrast was a physical weight on my chest. Just an hour ago, I was standing on a multi-million-dollar vessel, surrounded by the scent of expensive leather and aged cognac. Now I was breathing in the smell of damp carpet and old grease. The camera zooms out slowly, capturing me as a small, broken figure in the center of a cramped room that looked even more pathetic compared to the luxury I had just been kicked out of. My tiny studio apartment was a fortress of unfinished canvases and overdue notices, a far cry from the sprawling mansion in Cascade Heights where I grew up. The peeling wallpaper and the flickering overhead light were the only witnesses to my collapse. I sank onto my thrift store sofa, my left leg throbbing with a rhythm that felt like a ticking clock. I looked around at the life I had built away from my parents' shadow. Every piece of furniture, every paintbrush, and every book had been earned through 80-hour work weeks and skipping meals. I had pride in this poverty because it was mine, but tonight that pride felt like a lead weight, dragging me to the bottom of the ocean. My father Marcus always said that my independence was just a fancy word for being broke, and as I stared at my swollen, bruised limb, his voice echoed in my head with a cruel, mocking clarity. The luxury of the yacht felt like a dream I had been violently awakened from, leaving me in a reality where $8,000 might as well have been $8 million. I was trapped in the middle of a systemic failure, a black woman who had worked her way through college and built a business only to be one medical emergency away from losing everything. The silence of the apartment was deafening. There was no festive music here, no clinking glasses, just the sound of my own shallow breathing and the occasional drip of a leaky faucet. I realized that my family's wealth was a fortress designed to keep people like me out, even if those people shared their DNA. They lived in a world where problems were solved with a checkbook, while I lived in a world where a broken leg was a life sentence. The camera continues to pull back, showing the dark silhouette of the city's skyline through the window, with the glittering lights of the wealthy districts mocking me from the distance. I was only a few miles away from them, geographically, but socially and economically, I was on another planet. This room was my entire world now, a confined space of struggle where the only thing I truly owned was my pain and a pile of medical debt. I gripped the fabric of the sofa, my knuckles white as the cold reality settled into my marrow. I wasn't just broke, I was discarded. And in this tiny, dim room, the absolute isolation was more terrifying than the thought of the surgery I couldn't afford. I was staring at the flickering light of my kitchen when a heavy rhythmic pounding echoed against my door. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor or the sharp rap of a debt collector. It was frantic and familiar. I struggled to stand, my crutches scraping against the linoleum as I maneuvered toward the entrance. When I swung the door open, the smell hit me first. The thick metallic scent of a shipping warehouse mixed with the salt of honest, grueling labor. There stood Darnell, my baby brother, swaying slightly on his feet. He was still wearing his neon yellow Amazon safety vest, now stained with grease and road grime. His face was streaked with sweat that had dried into salt lines, and his eyes were bloodshot from a double shift. He looked like he had just come back from a war zone, but the moment he saw me leaning on those crutches, his exhaustion vanished, replaced by a raw, unfiltered fear. Keisha. He breathed out, his voice raspy from breathing in warehouse dust for 16 hours straight. I didn't even have time to answer before he was inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He looked at my leg, his jaw tightening so hard I could see the muscles pulsing in his neck. I saw the text, Keisha. I saw what they did in the group chat before they kicked us both out. He pulled a crumpled water bottle from his vest pocket and took a swig, his hands shaking. He was only 22, but tonight he looked 40. Darnell was the only one who didn't get the trust fund treatment. He was the one they labeled the failure because he wanted to work with his hands, because he didn't want to sit in a boardroom wearing a suit that cost more than a down payment on a house. He was currently living in a studio half the size of mine eating ramen so he could save up for his own mechanic shop. He sat on the edge of my worn-out coffee table, the heavy work boots he wore leaving faint dusty prints on the rug. He didn't ask me if I was okay because he already knew the answer. He had seen the same coldness from Marcus and Yolanda his entire life. He reached into the deep pocket of his cargo pants and pulled out a small, tattered envelope. I watched as he wiped his sweaty palms on his knees before handing it to me. His eyes met mine, and for the first time that night I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen by the only person who actually shared my soul, not just my last name. He told me he had just come straight from the fulfillment center, didn't even stop to wash the grime off his face. The camera pulls in tight on his tired, determined expression. In this world of billionaires and yachts, here was a man who smelled like hard work and loyalty, standing in the middle of my dim apartment like a beacon of hope. He was the brother they ignored, the son they were ashamed of, but to me he was the only hero left in the story. Darnell reached into the deep pocket of his cargo pants and pulled out a thick, tattered envelope stained with the same warehouse dust that covered his skin. He didn't say a word at first, just held it out with hands that were trembling from a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. I took it, feeling the unexpected weight of the paper, and when I opened it, my breath hitched. Inside was a stack of crumpled $20 bills, some folded at the corners, others smelling faintly of the oil from his workplace. It was exactly $1,000 in cash. I looked up at him, my eyes blurring with tears that I had been trying to hold back all night. Darnell, where did you get this? You were supposed to pay your tuition this Friday. I know how hard you have been saving for those mechanic classes. He sank onto the edge of my coffee table, the heavy thud of his body reflecting the bone-deep fatigue he was carrying. I sold my gaming rig, Keisha. The whole setup, the monitor, the custom tower, everything. And I pulled 3 straight double shifts at the fulfillment center back to back. I didn't sleep. I just kept thinking about that medical report you posted. He wiped a streak of grime from his forehead, leaving a dark smear across his brow. He told me that while our parents were busy picking out the thread count for the curtains on their new yacht, he was lifting 100-pound crates and watching the clock calculating every hour in terms of my surgery. He didn't care about the tuition or the classes anymore. To him, those things were secondary to making sure his sister didn't spend the rest of her life in pain because of our parents' cruelty. I tried to push the envelope back into his hand, telling him I couldn't take his future just to fix my present. But Darnell's expression hardened into a look of defiance I had only ever seen in our grandfather. Keep it, Keisha. It's not enough for the whole surgery, I know that. 8,000 is a mountain, but this is the first 1,000. This is the foundation. He told me he wasn't going to let Marcus and Yolanda win by watching me crumble. He said that if our family was going to be a business, then he was making a move that they would never understand. He was investing in me. He stood up, his joints popping from the strain of his labor, and looked around my dim apartment. He told me that we were the only real family each of us had left. The money wasn't a loan, and it wasn't a favor. It was a declaration of war against the coldness that had raised us. In that moment, the grease-stained bills in my hand felt more valuable than all the millions sitting in my father's bank account. Darnell had given me more than money. He had given me the will to fight back. He looked me in the eye and promised that he would keep working, keep grinding until we found a way to get the rest. For the first time since the accident, the suffocating weight of the $8,000 felt just a little bit lighter. The tears began to fall hot and uncontrollable, soaking into the rough paper of the envelope Darnell had just pressed into my hands. I looked at the stack of crumpled $20 bills money that literally smelled of his sweat, and the grueling night shifts at the warehouse, and felt a crushing weight of guilt. Darnell, I cannot take this, I whispered, my voice cracking under the pressure of my sobs. You have been saving for an entire year for your mechanic certification. This is your tuition. This is your only ticket out of that fulfillment center. I cannot let my leg be the reason you stay trapped in a job that is breaking your back. I tried to push the envelope back toward his calloused, grease-stained hands, but he caught my wrists with a strength that startled me. His eyes, bloodshot from exhaustion, locked onto mine with a fierce, unwavering intensity. Darnell took a deep, shaky breath, his voice dropping into a low, resonant tone that filled my small apartment. Listen to me, Keisha. All our lives we have lived in the shadows of people who call themselves family, but treat us like ornaments for their status. Our parents and Andre might be sitting on that yacht right now clinking glasses and talking about their legacy, but they are not family. He pointed a trembling finger at my crutches and continued with a hard, defiant edge to his voice. Real family is not the group of people who sit comfortably on a boat watching you drown, while they lecture you about how you should have learned to swim better. Real family is the person who jumps into the freezing water without a second thought. Family is the person who uses their last bit of breath to pull you back to the surface. I don't give a damn about that certification right now, because if I become the best mechanic in the world while my sister spends her life in a wheelchair because of their pride, then that success is worth nothing to me. I looked at my baby brother and realized that the boy I used to walk to school had grown into a man with more integrity than everyone on that yacht combined. He insisted that this money wasn't just for a surgery. It was a declaration that we would not let this world or our own parents break our spirits. He told me that tuition can be earned again, that classes will always be there, but our souls would die if we stood by and watched each other suffer in silence. I am not doing this because you are my sister, he said, a tired but genuine smile finally touching his lips. I am doing this because it is what a man is supposed to do for the person who has always had his back. He forced my fingers to close around the envelope, making me promise that I would call the hospital first thing in the morning to start the admission process. In this dim, peeling apartment, I had found a treasure that Marcus and Yolanda could never afford. It was absolute loyalty. It was a love without conditions or fine print. I clutched that envelope to my chest, feeling the weight of his sacrifice, and I knew then that this fight was no longer just mine. We were going to rise from these ashes together. The digital guillotine fell faster than I ever imagined. By the time the sun began to rise over the humid Atlanta skyline, Darnell and I were no longer members of the Marcus family legacy. It wasn't just a verbal dismissal on a yacht, it was a systematic erasure. Marcus had his lawyers send a formal notice to Darnell's apartment manager, and within hours his lease was terminated, under a clause about family-guaranteed credit that my father had intentionally revoked. We were being purged. I watched from my window as Darnell arrived at my doorstep, with nothing but 3 trash bags filled with his clothes and his heavy work boots hanging around his neck. His face was a mask of grim determination, but I could see the heartbreak in the way he slumped against the doorframe. We didn't say a word. We just started moving. My studio apartment was already cramped, but now it became a warehouse for our combined survival. We spent the morning dragging his few belongings into my small space, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly shrunk to 40 square feet of cracked linoleum and peeling wallpaper. The suburban luxury of our childhood felt like a fairy tale told by liars. We were now officially residents of the outskirts, living in a zone where the sirens never stopped and the streetlights flickered with a dying rhythm. Darnell refused to let me help him lift anything, his eyes constantly darting to my bandaged leg with a protective ferocity that made my throat tight. He set up a makeshift bed using a pile of old blankets in the corner of the kitchen, insisting that I keep the only bed we had so my leg could stay elevated. This was our new reality. A small hot room in a building that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. We sat on the floor that evening, sharing a single can of soup, the flickering light of a cheap lamp casting long, jagged shadows against the wall. Darnell told me he had checked his banking app one last time. Marcus hadn't just closed the accounts, he had clawed back every cent of the savings Darnell had earned since high school, claiming it was family property. We were starting at absolute zero. But as the distant sound of the highway hummed through the walls, Darnell reached over and gripped my hand. He told me that we were finally free from the weight of their expectations. We were the exiles of Cascade Heights, living in a shoebox on the edge of town. But for the first time in our lives, the air we breathed didn't belong to Marcus and Yolanda. We were poor, we were injured, and we were officially outcasts, but we were together. The room was small, but the silence between us was filled with a new kind of power. A shared understanding that the family who had cast us out had no idea what kind of fire they had just ignited in this tiny crowded room. I was rummaging through the last of the boxes Darnell had brought over when my hands brushed against something cold and solid buried deep beneath his old work hoodies. It was the small wooden box that had belonged to our grandmother Dorothy. My breath hitched as I pulled it out, feeling the rough texture of the dark mahogany and the tarnished brass latch that had seen better days. I remembered the last time I saw this box in our parents' mansion. Marcus had laughed when he saw me polishing it, calling it a piece of poverty-stricken garbage that smelled like a basement. Yolanda had told me to throw it in the trash, saying that keeping relics from a woman who died with nothing was a sign of a small mind. To them, if an object didn't have a designer logo or a high resale value, it was worthless. They had spent years trying to make me ashamed of the only woman who actually loved us without conditions. I sat on the floor of my cramped apartment, the flickering light of the single overhead bulb reflecting off the dust on the lid. Darnell watched me from his makeshift bed in the corner, his eyes wide with recognition. "That is Grandma's box," he whispered, his voice thick with nostalgia. "I thought they threw that out years ago." I shook my head, my fingers tracing the intricate carvings that had survived decades of neglect. I remember her telling me that the real wealth of our ancestors wasn't something you could see with your eyes. Marcus and Yolanda had ignored it because it didn't look like a stock portfolio or a deed to a yacht. They were so blinded by their new money that they forgot where the old strength came from. The camera pulls in tight on my face as I struggle with the rusted latch, the sound of the metal groaning echoing in the silent room. Finally, the latch gave way with a sharp snap. I expected to find old photos or perhaps a piece of costume jewelry. Instead, the box was lined with faded velvet and contained a single heavy envelope made of thick, yellowed parchment. My heart started to race as I realized this wasn't just a container for trinkets. It was a vessel for a secret. I looked at Darnell, who had crawled over to join me on the linoleum. This was the box our parents called trash. This was the junk they wanted us to discard so we could be more like them. But as I opened that envelope, I realized that Grandma Dorothy had played a long game that Marcus was too arrogant to ever suspect. She knew exactly what kind of people her son and daughter-in-law would become. She knew that one day, Darnell and I would be exactly where we were right now, discarded, broken, and searching for a way out. I felt a sudden overwhelming sense of her presence in the room, a warmth that countered the draft coming from the window. The box they mocked was about to become the very thing that dismantled their world. I reached for the documents inside my hands, no longer shaking, but steady with a purpose I hadn't felt since the accident. This wasn't just wood and dust. It was a weapon. I peeled back the flap of the heavy parchment envelope, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I thought Darnell could hear it. I expected to find a stash of emergency cash, or perhaps the deed to a small, forgotten plot of land in rural Georgia. But as I pulled the contents out, my confusion mirrored Darnell's as he leaned in closer. There was no money, no gold, just a single crisp document embossed with a faded blue seal and a series of signatures that looked like they belonged to a different century. It was a stock certificate for a company called Blue Horizon Logistics, dated June 12, 1995. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. According to the fine print, Grandma Dorothy had purchased 5% of this tiny independent shipping outfit back when they only owned 2 beat-up trucks and a rented garage. Darnell picked up the certificate, rotating it under the flickering kitchen light. 5% of a trucking company from 30 years ago, Keisha. This is what they called trash. He sounded deflated, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his Amazon uniform. I looked at the signatures again. Dorothy had bought these shares with the meager savings she earned cleaning houses for wealthy families in Buckhead. Marcus and Yolanda always mocked her for her small-time investments, calling her a dreamer who didn't understand how real wealth worked. They wanted the instant gratification of high-yield bonds and flashy real estate, while Grandma was playing a game they couldn't even perceive. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers trembling, as I typed the company name into a specialized financial database. My breath hitched when I saw the results. Blue Horizon Logistics hadn't just survived. They had been the silent engine behind the Southeast's e-commerce boom. In 2018, they were acquired by a global tech conglomerate in a multi-billion-dollar merger. I scrolled through the merger details, my eyes scanning for any mention of the original minority shareholders. There it was. Every original share had been converted into equity in the new parent company, then split 4 times over the last decade. I did the math on a scrap of paper, my hand shaking so hard the pen nearly flew out of my grip. Grandma Dorothy hadn't left us a memory. She had left us a mountain. Based on the current market value and 30 years of reinvested dividends that had been sitting in an escrow account, waiting for a legal heir. Those 5% shares were now worth approximately $4.5 million. I showed the screen to Darnell. He stared at the numbers for a long time, his jaw hanging open as the reality of our new life started to sink in. We weren't just the kids who got kicked off a yacht. We were the rightful owners of a fortune that made our father's net worth look like pocket change. Marcus and Yolanda had spent 30 years looking down on Grandma Dorothy's junk, never realizing that the real legacy was hidden in plain sight. They wanted us to throw this box away so we could be as hollow as they were, but Dorothy knew. She knew they would fail us, and she made sure we had the fuel to burn their world down. I looked at the certificate, then at my injured leg. The $8,000 I needed for surgery was no longer a mountain. It was a grain of sand. We were no longer victims of their cruelty. We were the architects of their downfall. I gripped the paper, feeling the power radiating from the ink, and realized the war had just shifted in our favor. I stared at the flickering screen of my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys, as the search results for Blue Horizon Logistics began to populate. Darnell leaned over my shoulder, his breathing heavy with a mix of exhaustion and desperate hope. At first, the financial jargon looked like a foreign language, but as I dug deeper into the SEC filings and historical merger records, the picture became terrifyingly clear. Grandma Dorothy's 5% stake wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a golden ticket that had been multiplying in the dark for decades. In 2018, Blue Horizon was the primary acquisition target for a global tech titan looking to dominate the southern supply chain. The merger hadn't just bought the trucks. It had converted every original share into high-value equity in a NASDAQ-listed conglomerate. I opened a compound interest calculator and started inputting the data from the certificate, accounting for 3 stock splits and 30 years of accumulated dividends that had been sitting in a dormant custodial account. As the final number flashed on the screen, the air left my lungs. $4,512,000. I refreshed the page thinking it was a glitch, a cruel joke played by a weary brain. But the numbers remained steady, glowing like a neon sign in our dark, cramped kitchen. Darnell let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, sinking to the floor as the weight of our reality shifted. We weren't just okay. We were wealthier than Marcus and Yolanda could ever dream of being. I looked at the certificate, then at the hospital bill for $8,000 that had almost cost me my leg. To my father, that amount was the price of a monthly boat polish. To me, it had been a death sentence. But now that debt was a grain of sand on a beach I owned. Grandma Dorothy had known. She had seen the greed festering in her own son, and knew that one day Darnell and I would be the ones she needed to protect from the shadows. She didn't leave her legacy to the successful son who worshipped yachts. She left it to the outcasts, who knew the value of a single dollar earned with sweat. The camera pans across the peeling wallpaper of our tiny apartment, highlighting the jagged contrast between our current poverty and the digital fortune on the screen. I felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with justice. This money was my surgery. It was Darnell's education. It was our freedom. But more than that, it was the fuel for a fire that would eventually consume the arrogance of the people who had discarded us. I looked at Darnell, his face streaked with warehouse grime, and realized the game had changed. We were no longer begging for scraps at the table of the elite. We were about to buy the entire building. I closed the laptop with a sharp click, the sound of a closing trap. The Keisha who stood on that yacht begging for mercy was gone. The Keisha who owned the future had just arrived. The surgical lights were the last thing I saw before the anesthesia took hold, but the image of that stock certificate was burned into my mind. When I finally woke up in the recovery room, the crushing weight that had been on my chest for weeks was gone. For the first time since the accident, the throbbing in my left leg was no longer the sound of dying nerves, but the pulse of a new beginning. Darnell was there, sitting in a plastic chair with his head resting against the wall, still wearing his warehouse boots. I reached out and squeezed his hand, and when he opened his eyes, he didn't see the broken sister he had been carrying. He saw a partner. The surgery was a complete success. The doctors said with intensive physical therapy, I would not only walk, but I would dance again. The $8,000 that Marcus and Yolanda refused to give me had been paid in full with a single click of a button, along with the best private rehabilitation plan money could buy. As the weeks of recovery passed, I didn't spend my time watching daytime television or wallowing in what I had lost. I spent every waking hour with my laptop propped up on my hospital bed, working with a team of high-end estate lawyers and forensic accountants. We liquidated a small portion of the Blue Horizon stock to secure our immediate future, but the rest was moved into a sophisticated trust designed for one-purpose expansion. I wasn't just going to be okay, I was going to be the storm my family never saw coming. I looked at the photos of their yacht parties on social media, seeing them smile as if Darnell and I never existed, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity. They thought they had pruned the dead branches from their family tree, but they didn't realize they had actually scattered the seeds of their own destruction. I looked at Darnell one evening while he was helping me practice my first steps without crutches. I am going to build something they can't ignore, I told him, my voice steady and low. We are going to take Grandma Dorothy's legacy and turn it into a fortress. We started by forming a private equity firm, Dorothy's Legacy Holdings. While my parents were busy maintaining their superficial status in Atlanta's high society, I was studying their debt structures and their failing investments. I found out that Marcus had over-leveraged the family firm to buy that Dewthween and maintain their extravagant lifestyle. They were a house of cards painted in gold. I made a vow right there in that hospital room, with the smell of antiseptic in the air and the sun setting over the city. I would not use this money to beg for their return. I would use it to buy the ground they stood on. I would build an empire that would make their success look like a lemonade stand. They wanted to teach me about responsibility and the value of a dollar. Well, I was about to give them a masterclass they would never forget. The Keisha who needed them was dead. The The Keisha who was coming for everything they valued was just getting started. Thought 2 years passed like a slow-motion train wreck for the elite Marcus family, while I rebuilt my soul in the silence of the outskirts. The news didn't come from a phone call because I was still dead to them, but through the frantic headlines of the Atlanta financial journals. Andre, the golden son, who once mocked my lack of insurance while leaning on his Tesla, had fallen victim to his own arrogance. He thought he was smarter than the market, pouring every cent of the family's liquid assets into a volatile cryptocurrency scheme that promised to double their fortune overnight. Tiffany, his white wife who had perfected the art of spending money she didn't earn, had encouraged the gamble, dreaming of a penthouse in Dubai. But the market didn't care about their pedigree or their yacht club memberships. The bubble burst, and it didn't just leak. It exploded, taking their dignity with it. I watched from my high-rise office at Dorothy's Legacy Holdings as the reports filtered in. They were over-leveraged and desperate. Marcus had put up the Cascade Heights mansion as collateral for Andre's latest venture, and now the banks were circling like sharks. The multi-million-dollar yacht, the very vessel where they had discarded me in the rain, was the first thing to be repossessed. I heard from a former associate that Marcus was seen screaming at the harbor master as they towed his pride and joy away, his expensive silk suit drenched in the same kind of rain I had stood in 2 years ago. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. They had valued a boat over their daughter's leg, and now the boat was gone and the leg was stronger than ever. The debt didn't stop at the yacht. The family firm, the crown jewel of my father's life work, was bleeding out. Andre's poor choices had triggered a series of margin calls that they couldn't meet. They were selling off furniture, jewelry, and the very cars they used to look down on me from. Tiffany's laughter had turned into a permanent snarl as she realized the lifestyle she married into was evaporating. The golden children were tarnished, and the powerful patriarch was realizing that his empire was built on sand. They were experiencing the same crushing weight of financial ruin that they had wished upon me as a lesson in responsibility. While they were scrambling to hide their collapse from their social circle, Darnell and I were moving in the shadows. We didn't celebrate their pain, but we observed it with a cold, surgical precision. We knew exactly which banks held their notes and which creditors were losing patience. Marcus and Yolanda were so busy trying to maintain the facade of wealth that they didn't notice the silent predator purchasing their debt. They thought they were being hit by bad luck, but in reality, they were being haunted by the ghost of the woman they had abandoned. The table had turned so far that it had flipped over. I sat in my leather chair, my heeled leg crossed comfortably, and watched the numbers on my screen. The people who told me I had no future were now watching their own future disappear into a digital abyss. The freelance artist they once ridiculed was now the only person holding the keys to their survival, and I wasn't in a hurry to open the door. As the Marcus empire began to fracture, Tiffany's mask of devotion didn't just slip, it shattered. She had never been in love with Andre. She was in love with the proximity to power and the unlimited credit line that came with his last name. Now that the bank accounts were freezing and the luxury cars were being hauled away, her fake honeyed sweetness turned into a razor-edged venom. She didn't have the stomach for the struggle she had so mockingly prescribed for me. While Andre sat in his darkened office trying to calculate his losses, Tiffany was already plotting her exit strategy. She began spending more time at a high-end law firm in Midtown, claiming she was consulting with experts to save the family assets. In reality, she was in the arms of a senior partner named Julian, a man who represented everything she valued: safety, whiteness, and a fresh bank account. The betrayal was surgical. Tiffany wasn't just looking for an affair, she was looking for a total transfer of wealth. Working with Julian, she began moving the last of the Marcus family's liquid assets into offshore accounts under the guise of asset protection. She exploited Andre's desperation, whispering in his ear that they needed to hide what was left from the creditors. He was so blinded by his own failure and his need for her approval that he signed every document she put in front of him. He didn't realize he wasn't protecting his future, He was handing her the keys to his coffin. While my parents were still trying to figure out which country club memberships to cancel, Tiffany was already packing her designer luggage for a life that didn't include a disgraced black family. The irony was chilling. The woman who had called me an emotional blackmailer was now executing a cold-blooded financial heist against her own husband. She had no loyalty to the legacy Marcus had built, because to her, we were always just a means to an end. I watched the movement of these funds through my private investigators, seeing the digital trail of her greed. She was gutting them from the inside out, leaving nothing but a hollow shell for the banks to fight over. She and Julian were laughing behind closed doors, mocking the arrogance of the Marcus men who thought they were too powerful to be played. By the time Andre realized what was happening, the accounts were empty, and Tiffany was gone. She filed for divorce the same day the foreclosure notice hit the mansion, citing irreconcilable differences and demanding a massive settlement based on the very assets she had already stolen. She left him with the debt, the shame, and the crushing realization that he had traded his own sister for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a temporary paycheck. I watched the security footage of her leaving their home for the last time, her head held high, stepping into Julian's car, without a single glance back at the wreckage she had helped create. The woman who lectured me on responsibility had proven to be the most irresponsible of all, a predator who fed on the very family that had once called her their own. The house of Marcus was now truly divided, and the foundation was completely gone. While Marcus and Yolanda were busy fighting off the vultures, they could see they never noticed the shadow we were casting over their entire lives. Darnell and I sat in our sleek, glass-walled headquarters a world away from the cramped studio where we started and watched the final pieces of our parents' empire crumble. We didn't approach them directly. That would have been too merciful. Instead, we operated through a shell corporation called Blackwood Acquisitions. To the world, it was just another faceless private equity firm cleaning up the mess of a failed dynasty. To us, it was the instrument of our ultimate justice. Darnell handled the logistics of the buyouts with a cold, calculated efficiency that made me proud. He had traded his Amazon safety vest for tailored suits, but he still possessed the relentless work ethic of a man who knew what it meant to have nothing. He spent weeks negotiating with the banks that held the predatory loans Andre had taken out. One by one, we began to buy their debt. We bought the mortgage on the Cascade Heights mansion. We bought the defaulted notes on the family firm's equipment. We even bought the outstanding judgments from the vendors they had failed to pay during their high society galas. By the end of the month, Marcus didn't owe the banks anymore. He owed us. Every morning I reviewed the ledger of their failures. It was a map of their arrogance. They had spent so much energy trying to prove they were superior to the freelance daughter and the mechanic's son that they had neglected the basic foundations of their own house. They were so blinded by the glare of their own reflection that they couldn't see the water rising around them. Marcus was still trying to maintain appearances, wearing his gold watch to meetings with bankruptcy lawyers, unaware that the very chair he was sitting in was now technically my property. Yolanda was still trying to host small, desperate tea parties to keep her social standing, not knowing that the house she was standing in was scheduled for seizure by a company she had never heard of. There was a profound, silent power in holding their fate in my hands. I held the papers that could put them on the street tomorrow. I held the power to strip them of the last shred of dignity they had left, just as they had stripped me of mine on that rainy pier. Darnell asked me if I felt guilty, and I looked at my healed leg, remembering the white-hot pain and the sound of my father's laughter. I told him that this wasn't about revenge, it was about the lesson in responsibility they were so eager to teach me. They wanted me to hit rock bottom to learn the value of $1. Well, they were finally at the bottom, and I was the one holding the rope. We were waiting for the perfect moment to reveal our faces, to let them see that the children they discarded had become the titans who owned their every breath. The trap was set, the documents were signed, and all that was left was to walk through the front door and reclaim what was ours. The irony of fate finally solidified into a single binding contract. Marcus was forced to put the Pride of Atlanta, the very yacht that had served as the stage for my public humiliation, up for emergency auction. He was desperate. The walls of his empire were closing in, and the monthly maintenance fees he once boasted about were now a noose around his neck. He called it a temporary liquidation, a strategic move to regain liquidity, but the city knew better. The king was selling his crown just to keep the lights on. I watched the listing go live, my fingers tracing the scars on my leg that had finally faded into silver lines. I didn't hesitate. I authorized Blackwood Acquisitions to place a bid that was just high enough to end the auction instantly, but low enough to twist the knife. The day of the transfer arrived under a sky that was eerily similar to the night I was cast out, gray, heavy, and threatening rain. Marcus stood on the pier, his shoulders slumped for the first time in his life. He looked aged, his expensive blazer hanging loosely on a frame thinned by stress. He was waiting for the mysterious representative of the holding company that had snatched his prize away. He didn't know that the mystery buyer wasn't a corporate shark from New York or a tech mogul from Silicon Valley. He stood there clutching a leather briefcase, trying to maintain a shred of the authority he used to wield like a weapon. He was waiting for a savior, unaware that he was about to meet his judge. Darnell and I pulled up to the marina in a black SUV, the tires crunching on the gravel, with a sound like breaking bone. As the door opened, I stepped out first, my gait smooth and perfectly balanced. I didn't need crutches. I didn't need a hand to hold. I walked toward him with a grace that was funded by the very ancestors he had mocked. Behind me, Darnell followed his presence, formidable and silent. Marcus squinted against the wind, his eyes widening as we came into focus. He looked for the buyer, looking past us as if we were still invisible ghosts from his past. "Where is the CEO?" he demanded, his voice a shaky shadow of its former boom. "I have the title transfer ready for the Blackwood representative." I stopped just inches from him, the scent of the salt air mixing with his fading cologne. "I am the CEO, Dad," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. "And the Blackwood representative is standing right behind me." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the lapping of the water against the hull of the boat he no longer owned. I reached out and took the folder from his trembling hand. "You told me that $8,000 was the price of maintaining this vessel for a month, and that I wasn't worth the investment. Well, it turns out you were right about the price, but dead wrong about the value. I own the pride now, Marcus. And as of this morning, I own the mortgage on your house too." I watched the realization hit him, a physical blow that made him stumble back against the railing. The man who taught me that life was a series of transactions had just realized he was completely bankrupt. The phone on my desk vibrated, the caller ID flashing a number I hadn't seen in 730 days. I didn't have to guess who it was. That specific sequence of digits was etched into my memory like a scar. I signaled Darnell to stay quiet as I pressed the speakerphone. I expected a sob, perhaps a stuttered apology, or at least the decency of a hello. Instead, Yolanda's voice came through the line, as sharp and demanding as a frost-covered blade. "Keisha, thank God you finally picked up," she snapped, bypassing 2 years of silence, as if we had only spoken yesterday. "I suppose you've heard about the situation with the firm. Your father is in a state, and that woman Tiffany has practically bled us dry. We need $200,000 by tomorrow morning to stay the foreclosure on the main house." I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking softly, and looked at the panoramic view of the city's skyline. Not a single word about my leg, not a question about how I survived the night she watched me limp into the rain. I felt a cold, hollow sensation in my chest that quickly solidified into a fortress. "You sound stressed, Mother," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Her tone shifted instantly, becoming that practiced, manipulative sweetness she used on charity boards. "Well, of course I am, dear. It's been a nightmare. But we know you've been doing some freelance work, and we heard you might have come into some luck. As a family, we have to protect the estate. It's your responsibility to help us maintain our standing. After all, we provided for you for years. Think of this as a way to show you've finally learned the maturity we talked about on the boat." The sheer audacity of her words was almost breathtaking. She wasn't calling to reconcile, she was calling to collect. To her, I wasn't a daughter who had been lost and found. I was an untapped resource, a backup insurance policy she had decided to cash in. She spoke about responsibility as if she hadn't abdicated every maternal duty the moment she chose a yacht over my health. Yolanda, I said, cutting through her frantic listing of unpaid bills. Do you remember what you told me at the harbor? You said my injury was a lesson in self-reliance. You said that life would teach me the lessons you couldn't. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. That was different, Keisha. She stammered, her voice rising in pitch. We were trying to build your character. This is about the family name. If we lose the house, it's a public disgrace. Surely you wouldn't be so petty as to hold a grudge when our entire legacy is at stake. I looked at Darnell, who was shaking his head in disbelief. I realized then that Yolanda would never change. To her, people were just pillars meant to hold up her ceiling, and when one broke, she simply expected it to fix itself. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a profound sense of closure. You're right, Mother, I replied. This isn't about a grudge. It's about the market. And currently your character is a liability I'm not willing to fund. I disconnected the call before she could scream the silence that followed, feeling like the first real breath of air I had taken in years. The transformation of Darnell was perhaps the most profound victory of our journey. The camera pans across a high-tech glass-walled boardroom in the heart of Atlanta's new financial district, far removed from the stagnant traditionalism of my father's old office. Darnell stands at the head of a long mahogany table, no longer wearing a grease-stained safety vest or carrying the scent of a warehouse. He is dressed in a charcoal gray tailored suit that fits his broad frame perfectly, his presence commanding a room full of seasoned analysts and community leaders. He is the chief executive officer of Dorothy's Legacy Fund, a multi-million-dollar venture capital firm we built from the literal ashes of our ancestors' wisdom. He hasn't just climbed the social ladder, he has built a new one. His rise was fueled by the same grit that kept him working double shifts when I was at my lowest. Darnell didn't just take the money and hide. He invested it into the people the world usually ignores. Under his leadership, the fund has become a powerhouse for minority-owned tech startups and blue-collar entrepreneurship. He turned Grandma Dorothy's 5% into a 10-digit empire that focuses on sustainability and equity. He speaks with the authority of a man who has seen both sides of the coin, his voice steady and devoid of the arrogance that eventually blinded Marcus. He doesn't look for social status or prestige. He looks for potential and character, the two things our parents could never quantify. The camera captures a moment of quiet reflection as he looks out the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the city. On his desk sits a small framed photo of Grandma Dorothy and a miniature model of the mechanic school he finally opened, the Dorothy M. Turner Institute of Automotive Engineering. He didn't just get his certification, he built a temple for others to get theirs. He manages our portfolio with a surgical precision that has made him one of the most respected CEOs in the Southeast. People who used to overlook him now scramble for a seat at his table. But Darnell hasn't forgotten the linoleum floor of my old studio apartment, or the weight of that first $1,000 he gave me. He turns to his executive assistant and signs off on a new initiative, a zero-interest medical loan program for freelance workers. It is his silent tribute to the night that nearly broke us. Darnell has become the man Marcus claimed to be, but never was a true provider and a visionary leader. He doesn't lead with fear, he leads with the memory of sacrifice. As he walks out of the boardroom, his footsteps echoing with confidence, it is clear that the legacy of Grandma Dorothy is no longer a hidden secret in a wooden box. It is a living, breathing empire that Darnell carries on his shoulders with pride. He is no longer the failure of the family. He is the architect of a future that Marcus and Yolanda are no longer allowed to inhabit. The golden embossed invitation sat on the scarred kitchen table of the cramped rental apartment where Marcus and Yolanda now resided. The card was heavy, expensive, and smelled of high-end printing ink, a scent that used to be the baseline of their existence, but was now a painful luxury. The heading read, The New Legacy, a Night of Restorative Justice, a gala hosted by Dorothy's Legacy Holdings. For Marcus, this wasn't just a social event, it was a lifeline. Their credit was decimated, their names were blacklisted in every major bank in Georgia, and their last remaining assets were tied up in a legal battle with Tiffany's lawyers. This gala represented the only gathering of private lenders and angel investors who still had the liquidity to offer the high-interest bridge loan Marcus desperately needed to avoid total bankruptcy. Yolanda gripped the edge of the invitation, her fingers trembling. "Marcus, look at the venue," she whispered, her voice thin and brittle. "It's being held at the old Harbor Club, right where the yacht used to be docked. If we can just get in that room, if we can talk to the directors of this Dorothy Fund, maybe we can convince them that our family name still holds value." She was still delusional, clinging to the idea that the Marcus name was a currency people still wanted to trade. She spent the afternoon sewing a loose thread on her last designer dress, while Marcus polished his shoes until his arms ached. They were like two actors preparing for a play where the stage had already been burned down. They believed this mysterious fund was their salvation, a nameless entity that happened to share their grandmother's name by some cosmic coincidence. Andre sat in the corner staring at his phone, his face sallow and defeated. He had been the one to find the invitation in the mail, but he didn't share his parents' desperate optimism. He knew that in the world of venture capital, people didn't give out millions based on a handshake anymore. But even he felt the pull of the event. It was a chance to stand in a room that didn't smell like failure. They spent their last few $100s on a car service, wanting to arrive at the harbor in style, unaware that the style they were chasing was now owned by the very people they had discarded. They convinced themselves that the organizers of the New Legacy would see their pedigree and offer them a seat at the table. The irony was a silent observer in the room. They were preparing to beg for mercy from an empire built on the very trash they had told me to throw away. Marcus practiced his pitch in the mirror, adjusting his tie, trying to find the mask of the powerful patriarch he used to be. He told Yolanda that this was the night they would reclaim their throne. He had no idea that the New Legacy wasn't a fresh start for him, but a final curtain call. As they stepped into the car heading toward the harbor, they weren't going to a gala. They were walking into a trap designed by the two people who knew their weaknesses better than anyone else. They were chasing a ghost, and the ghost was waiting for them with the bill. The final meeting took place in a sterile conference room, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and the cold finality of legal defeat. Andre sat at the long table, his eyes bloodshot, staring at the divorce decree that lay between them like a death warrant. Across from him, Tiffany looked radiant, wearing a cream-colored power suit and the emerald earrings Andre had bought her during their last trip to Paris. There was no trace of the supportive wife she once pretended to be. She didn't look like a woman ending a marriage. She looked like a CEO who had just completed a successful hostile takeover. Julian, her lover and lawyer, sat beside her, his hand resting casually on her shoulder in a blatant display of possession. Andre's voice was a ragged whisper as he pushed the papers back toward her. "Tiff, you can't do this. You moved all the liquid capital. You left me with the personal guarantees on the commercial loans. I'm looking at $50 million in debt while you're walking away with a clean slate. I loved you. I gave you everything." He reached out as if to touch her hand, but she recoiled with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The honeyed sweetness she had used to manipulate him for years was replaced by a sharp, icy clarity. "Don't touch me, Andre," she snapped, her voice echoing in the empty room. "You gave me what I required at the time. But let's be honest about what you are now. You're a liability. You're a hollow man who thought a Tesla and a fancy last name made him a king." She leaned in, her eyes scanning his haggard face with the cold precision of an appraiser. "I didn't fall in love with you. I fell in love with the access you provided. But you were too arrogant to see that you were bleeding out long before I arrived. You spent so much time looking down on your sister for being poor that you didn't notice you were becoming a beggar yourself." Andre's jaw dropped, the betrayal cutting deeper than the financial ruin. You helped me hide those assets. You told me it was to protect the family. You lied to me every single night. Tiffany let out a short, mocking laugh and looked at Julian before turning back to Andre. I didn't lie, honey. I did protect the family, my future. You were just the bridge I used to get there. She stood up, smoothing her skirt with a slow, deliberate motion. You're sitting here crying about a debt you created with your own ego. You're the one who thought you could gamble with the firm's future and win. I just made sure I wasn't the one buried in the rubble when your house of cards finally fell. She picked up her designer bag, the gold hardware clinking with a sound that reminded Andre of the yacht's railings. She walked toward the door but stopped at the threshold, looking back at him one last time. It's funny, really. You called Keisha a failure because she didn't have insurance. Well, look at you now. You have no money, no wife, no home, and a debt that will take 3 lifetimes to pay off. You're not a businessman, Andre. You're just a spoiled boy who ran out of other people's money. Enjoy the ruins. She stepped out into the hallway, her heels clicking a rhythmic victory march that faded into the distance. Andre was left alone in the silence, the weight of the $50 million debt finally crushing the air from his lungs. He looked at the divorce papers, seeing the ink of his own signature, and realized that Tiffany hadn't just taken his money. She had taken the last shred of his dignity. He was a man with a famous name and a bankrupt soul, discarded by the very woman he had betrayed his own flesh and blood for. The silence of the room felt like a tomb, and for the first time in his life, Andre Marcus understood exactly what it felt like to be completely, utterly alone. The camera stays low, capturing the rhythmic, confident strike of designer stilettos against the polished marble floor of the Harbor Club. There is no limp, no hesitation, only the steady grace of a woman who has reclaimed her own body and her destiny. As the camera pans up, it reveals Keisha in a gown of architectural perfection, a deep midnight silk that catches the light like the surface of the ocean at night. Every stitch of the fabric radiates power, not the borrowed power of a father's name, but the hard-earned authority of a self-made titan. Around her neck sits a single breathtaking pendant, a piece of raw mahogany encased in gold, a tribute to the wooden box that changed everything. The grand ballroom is a sea of Atlanta's most influential figures, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the low hum of high-stakes conversation. As Keisha moves through the crowd, heads turn and voices drop into hushed whispers. People who once ignored her now scramble to catch her eye, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and fear. She doesn't stop to indulge them. Her gaze is fixed on the stage where a large digital display shows the crest of Dorothy's legacy holdings. The camera tracks her movement in one long sweeping shot, highlighting the stark contrast between the woman who was once discarded on this very pier and the queen who now owns the ground beneath their feet. In the shadows near the back of the room, Marcus, Yolanda, and Andre stand frozen. They look like ghosts haunting their own funeral. Marcus is tugging at his collar, his face a sickly shade of gray, as he realizes the mystery investor he came to beg for mercy from is the daughter he left in the rain. Yolanda's hand is pressed against her mouth, her eyes darting around the room, realizing that every socialite she ever tried to impress is now witnessing her absolute irrelevance. Andre is slumped against a pillar, the weight of his $50 million debt making him look small, withered, and utterly defeated. They are staring at Keisha's back, seeing a level of success they can no longer even comprehend. Keisha reaches the steps of the stage and turns to face the audience. The spotlight hits her, illuminating the cold, sharp beauty of a survivor. She takes a breath, the silence in the room becoming absolute. Good evening, she begins, her voice amplified and clear, carrying a resonance that commands the space. 2 years ago, I stood at this harbor and was told that a person's value is determined by their net worth and their utility to a legacy. I was told that if the market didn't value my life, then my life wasn't worth saving. She pauses, her eyes finding Marcus in the crowd and locking onto him with a gaze that strips him bare. I realized then that the old legacy was built on pride, exclusion, and the worship of machines over people. She continues, her voice growing stronger. But tonight we celebrate a new legacy. One built on the grit of those who work double shifts, the vision of those who dream in cramped studios, and the wisdom of a woman who knew that real wealth is something you carry in your soul. The camera zooms in tight on Keisha's face, capturing the fierce, triumphant spark in her eyes. I didn't just survive the storm my family left me in. I bought the clouds, I bought the wind, and tonight I am here to tell you that the reign of the arrogant is officially over. She gestures to Darnell, who stands in the wings looking every bit the CEO he has become. Together we are taking the keys back, not just to this building, but to the future of this city. To those of you here tonight looking for a handout or a bridge loan to save a failing ego, let me be clear. This fund does not invest in shadows. We invest in fire. And if you aren't willing to burn for your truth, you have no place at this table. She steps back from the microphone as the room erupts into a standing ovation, the sound echoing like thunder. Marcus and Yolanda are left standing in the dark, invisible and uninvited, watching as their daughter officially erases their names from history. The irony was a jagged blade cutting through the last of Marcus's dignity. As the applause for Keisha's speech roared from inside the ballroom, the heavy brass doors swung shut, leaving Marcus, Yolanda, and Andre standing in the cold, sterile hallway of the Harbor Club. They lunged toward the entrance, their faces pale with a frantic, sweating desperation. But before Marcus could even reach the handle, two massive security guards in charcoal suits stepped forward, their bodies forming an immovable wall of muscle and professional indifference. "Hold on there," the taller guard said, his voice flat and devoid of the respect Marcus had spent 40 years demanding. "This is a private event. Invitations and credentials only." Marcus straightened his blazer, trying to summon the ghost of his former power. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am Marcus Marcus. That is my daughter on that stage. Now move aside immediately. I need to speak with the chairperson of the fund. It is a family matter of extreme urgency." The guard didn't blink. He looked Marcus up and down, his eyes lingering on the frayed cuffs of Marcus's shirt and the scuffed toes of his shoes, details that shouted bankrupt to anyone trained to notice. He then looked at Yolanda, whose dress, while once couture, was now clearly out of season and poorly fitted. His gaze finally settled on Andre, who looked like a man who had been living out of a suitcase for a month. "The invitation specifically states a black-tie dress code," the guard replied, gesturing to a sign near the velvet rope. "You three don't meet the requirements for entry. Beyond that, the chairperson has a very specific no-contact list for this evening. Your names are at the top of it." Yolanda's voice rose into a shrill, desperate plea. "You don't understand. We are the family. Keisha is my daughter." "She's just confused. She's playing a game. She'll be furious if she finds out you kept us out here in the hall like common beggars. Please just tell her the chairperson's parents are here. We just need 5 minutes to discuss a loan arrangement. Our house is being seized on Monday." She reached out to grab the guard's sleeve, but he stepped back with practiced precision. "Ma'am, if you touch me again, I will have to escort you from the premises forcibly." The chairperson, Ms. Turner, was very clear. No exceptions. No intruders. Andre let out a hollow, bitter laugh from behind them. "Turner," he muttered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "She took Grandma's maiden name. She didn't just kick us out of the business, she erased the Marcus name entirely. She's not our sister anymore, Mom. She's the woman who owns our debt." Marcus ignored his son, his eyes wild as he spotted a junior associate he used to mentor walking toward the doors. "Hey, Williams, tell them who I am." The associate looked at Marcus, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, followed by a deep, palpable embarrassment. He didn't stop. He didn't offer a hand. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked away, hurrying into the ballroom, as if the Marcus family were a contagious disease. "Please," Marcus whispered, his voice finally breaking the arrogance replaced by a raw, pathetic begging. "Just let me see her. I'll sign whatever she wants. I'll apologize. Just tell her I'm here. Tell her her father is waiting." The guard checked his earpiece, listened for a moment, and then looked back at the broken man in front of him. The chairperson says she doesn't have a father, sir. She only has a board of directors, and they've already reviewed your application. It was denied for lack of character and insufficient collateral. Now I suggest you leave before we call the police for trespassing. The doors groaned as they settled into their frames, the sound of the celebration inside fading into a muffled hum. Marcus, Yolanda, and Andre stood in the empty corridor, surrounded by the silence of their own making. They were only 20 feet away from the wealth that could save them, yet they were on the wrong side of a glass they could no longer break. The people who had once used their status as a weapon were now being destroyed by the very rules they had created. They weren't just poor, they were irrelevant. The heavy glass doors of the elevator hissed open, and the air in the lobby seemed to sharpen. Tiffany stepped out draped in a floor-length white mink stole that practically glowed against the dim evening light of the harbor. She wasn't alone. Julian, the lawyer who had helped her dismantle the Marcus estate, held her waist with a proprietary grip, his smile as polished as his Italian loafers. She looked like a woman who had never known a day of struggle, a stark, cruel contrast to the three broken figures huddled near the security desk. Marcus and Yolanda froze. They looked like statues of salt trapped in the middle of their humiliation. Tiffany didn't look away. She steered Julian toward them with the deliberate grace of a predator who wanted to play with her food one last time. She stopped just a few feet away, her eyes raking over Yolanda's outdated dress and the visible sweat on Marcus's brow. "Oh, goodness," she said, her voice a melodic trill that carried across the quiet lobby. "Julian, look. It's the welcoming committee. I didn't realize they were hiring greeters for the gala. I hope the pay is better than the Marcus family dividends, though I imagine even a minimum wage is an upgrade for you three right now." Yolanda's face flushed a deep, painful crimson. "Tiffany, how can you speak to us like this? After everything we did for you, after the lifestyle we provided, you're wearing jewelry my son bought you with money. He's now losing his life over Tiffany." Let out a dry, sharp laugh, reaching up to adjust an emerald earring. "Your son, Andre." She glanced at Andre, who was staring at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. Andre didn't provide this, Yolanda. Andre was just a very expensive, very incompetent middleman. I earned this by having the foresight to leave a sinking ship before the rats realized they were underwater. She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the salt air. "And don't worry about the jewelry. Julian is getting me a much larger set tomorrow to celebrate the finalization of the asset transfer. You remember asset transfers, don't you, Marcus? Or did you forget how those work when you lost the mansion?" Marcus stepped forward, his fists clenched, his voice trembling with a desperate, impotent rage. "You're a thief, Tiffany. You're a low-life opportunist who crawled into our home and bled us dry. You should be ashamed to show your face here." Ashamed? Tiffany tilted her head, her smile widening into something genuinely terrifying. "Marcus, I'm the only one here who actually looks like they belong. You're the ones begging guards for a glimpse of the daughter you threw away. It's poetic, really. You spent years calling Keisha a charity case, and now you're the one standing in the lobby looking for a handout." She turned to Julian, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone to hear. "Darling, do we have any spare change? I'd hate to think they can't afford the bus ride back to whatever hole they're living in now." Julian chuckled, pulling a crisp $100 bill from his wallet and holding it out toward Marcus. "Here you go, old man. For old time's sake. Consider it a tip for the entertainment." Marcus stared at the bill, his dignity warring with the sheer crushing weight of his poverty. He didn't take it, but the fact that he hesitated, the fact that his hand even twitched toward the money, was the final victory Tiffany wanted. She watched that moment of hesitation with a look of pure triumph. "Keep it, Julian," she said, pulling his arm away. "They need to learn the value of $1. Remember? That was the family motto, wasn't it? Well, here is your lesson. $1 is worth nothing if you don't have the soul to keep it. She looked at the security guards and gave them a dazzling smile. Gentlemen, please make sure these people don't block the exit. Some of us have an actual legacy to celebrate. She turned her back on them without another word, her white fur trailing behind her as she and Julian walked toward their waiting limousine. The doors hissed shut behind them, leaving the Marcus family in the silence of their own ruin. They weren't just broke. They had been stripped of the one thing they thought they possessed, the respect of the world they had worshipped. As the lights of the limo faded into the night, Marcus realized that the woman he had chosen over his own daughter had been the final nail in his coffin. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom finally swung open, not for the security guards, but for the host herself. The hallway fell into a vacuum of silence as Keisha stepped into the frame. The overhead spotlights of the club's grand foyer seemed to track her movement automatically, casting a brilliant, unforgiving glow that made the midnight silk of her gown shimmer like liquid obsidian. She moved with a deliberate, haunting grace, the clicking of her heels echoing against the marble like the ticking of a countdown. Behind her, Darnell walked in lockstep, his face a granite mask of cold success. They didn't look like the children Marcus and Yolanda had raised. They looked like the owners of the world. Marcus gasped, the sound catching in his throat like a shard of glass. He stumbled back, his hand reaching out blindly for a support that wasn't there. Yolanda's knees buckled and she had to grip the edge of a velvet-covered stanchion to keep from collapsing. The shock on their faces was a visceral, raw thing, a mixture of terror, disbelief, and a sudden, agonizing recognition. This wasn't the daughter they had left shivering in the rain. This was the woman who had spent the last 2 years systematically dismantling their life from the shadows. Keisha stopped exactly 10 feet away from them, the perfect distance to look down on them without being touched by their desperation. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink into their marrow. Her eyes cold and clear as a mountain stream scanned Marcus's face, noting every new wrinkle and every sign of his decay. She saw the man who had valued a yacht over her ability to walk, and she felt nothing but a profound, icy clarity. Keisha Yolanda's voice was a broken whimper, her eyes searching for a shred of the daughter she used to manipulate. "Oh, Keisha, thank God. We didn't know. We didn't know it was you. The guards, they were so rude. Tell them who we are. Tell them to let us in. We're so proud of you, baby. We always knew you had this in you." She took a step forward, her hand outstretched in a pathetic clawing gesture, but Darnell shifted his weight, his presence alone forcing her to stop. Keisha's expression didn't soften. If anything, it turned to stone. "You knew who I was the night you watched me limp into the dark," she said, her voice low and resonant, carrying a power that made Marcus flinch. "You knew who I was when you blocked my number while I was waiting for surgery. You knew exactly who I was when you told me that my value was 0 because my bank account was empty." She tilted her head, her gaze shifting to Marcus. "Do you remember the lesson, Dad? You told me the market determines the price. Well, I've been studying the market, and right now the Marcus name is trading at a loss so deep it's not even worth the paper it's printed on." Marcus tried to find his voice, his chest heaving. "You bought the debt?" He wheezed, the realization finally manifesting in words. "You were Blackwood. You were the one who took the house. You took the firm. You took everything. Why? After everything I gave you, I raised you in luxury. I didn't take anything that you didn't throw away." "First," Keisha replied, her voice cutting through his excuses, "you traded your children for a lifestyle, Marcus. I just bought the lifestyle back. And as for the house, it's being converted into a free clinic for uninsured workers. Grandma Dorothy would have liked that. It's a better use for the land than a monument to your ego." She turned to Darnell, who handed her a small, elegant envelope. She didn't open it. She simply let it drop to the floor at Marcus's feet. "Inside that envelope is a one-way bus ticket for each of you to the outskirts of the city," she said, "and the address of a shelter that accepts people with no references. It's the same neighborhood where Darnell and I started over. Consider it my final investment in your character. The camera zooms in on Marcus and Yolanda's faces, their eyes wide with the horror of total, irreversible exile. They weren't just losing their money, they were being deleted from the world they worshipped. Keisha turned her back on them, her silk train sweeping across the floor with a sound like a closing chapter. She walked back toward the ballroom, toward the lights and the music and the future she had built with her own hands. Darnell followed her, closing the brass doors behind them with a heavy final thud. The Marcus family was left in the dim light of the hallway, standing over a bus ticket, while the daughter they discarded began the celebration of a legacy they would never understand. The heavy brass doors had barely settled when Marcus, fueled by a final manic burst of desperation, shoved past the surprised security guards. He didn't care about dignity anymore. He was a man staring into the abyss of total poverty, and he saw Keisha as the only hand that could pull him out. He sprinted toward the stage, his breathing ragged and his expensive shoes slipping on the polished wood. Yolanda and Andre followed in his wake, like a trail of wreckage, their faces twisted with a terrifying hollow hope. The crowd gasped, the music cut out, and 100 elite eyes fixed on the spectacle of the fallen patriarch, scrambling for a foothold. Marcus reached the foot of the stage, his hands gripping the edge, as if it were a life raft. Keisha, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, he shouted, his voice cracking and echoing through the silent ballroom. I knew it. I always told your mother you had that fire in you. I knew you were the one who would take this family to the next level. This was all just a test, honey. A trial to see if you could handle the pressure of the real world, and look at you. You passed with flying colors. He laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that made the guests shift uncomfortably. Now tell these people to put the champagne back on our tab. Tell them the Marcus family is back. Help us, Keisha. Just a small transfer, just enough to settle the bank. We're a team again. Keisha stood perfectly still at the center of the stage, the spotlight surrounding her like a halo of ice. She didn't look down. She didn't flinch. She simply looked through him as if he were made of glass. Beside her, Darnell stepped forward, his shadow falling over Marcus's face. The guards moved in to intervene, but Keisha raised a single hand to stop them. She wanted the room to hear this. She wanted the city to witness the final transaction. A test, Keisha asked, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. You call leaving me in the rain with a shattered leg a test. You call ignoring my calls for surgery a trial. She stepped to the very edge of the platform, looking down at the man who had spent his life demanding worship. You didn't give me a test, Marcus. You gave me an execution. The only problem is I didn't die. And the woman standing in front of you doesn't owe a single cent to the man who tried to bury her. Yolanda reached the stage, then her face a mask of practiced, tearful, motherly concern. Keisha, darling, don't be like this. We're your blood. You can't let your own brother live on the street. Andre has nothing left. We have nothing left. We're sorry if the lesson was too harsh, but we did it out of love. We wanted you to be strong like us. Look at how strong you are now. You have millions. What is a few 100,000 to your own mother? Keisha looked at Yolanda, and for the first time that night, a small, sad smile touched her lips. You're right, Mother. I am strong. But I didn't get this strength from you. I got it from the brother who sold his future to pay for my surgery. I got it from the grandmother who knew you'd eventually fail us. She reached into the small silk clutch at her waist and pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill, the same one Darnell had given her on that first night in her studio. She let the bill flutter down, landing right on Marcus's shoulder. There is your help, she said. It's more than you gave me when I was dying in that hospital bed. Use it to buy a meal because it's the last thing you'll ever receive from the Turner legacy. Darnell, see them out. They're trespassing on a future they aren't invited to. Darnell nodded to the security team. The guards didn't hesitate this time. They grabbed Marcus and Andre by the arms, dragging them backward toward the exit. Marcus screamed, his voice raw with a mixture of rage and grief, calling out Keisha's name as if it were a magic spell that had lost its power. Yolanda followed them, sobbing into her hands, her heels clicking a desperate final retreat. The doors of the ballroom closed with a heavy, definitive boom, sealing the Marcus family out in the cold for good. Keisha turned back to the audience, the smile vanishing as she signaled the orchestra to resume. The gala continued, but everyone in that room knew they had just watched the old world die and a new one begin. I reached into the inner pocket of my midnight silk gown and pulled out a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times the edges were transparent. It was the original hospital invoice for $8,000, the document that had once represented the barrier between my mobility and a lifetime of pain. I held it up for the entire room to see the white paper stark against the dark elegance of the stage. Marcus and Yolanda froze as they were being hauled toward the doors, their eyes locking onto that small, wrinkled sheet. "This paper is 2 years old," I said, my voice cutting through the stifled gasps of the audience. "This was the price of my leg. This was the amount I begged you for while I was lying in a hospital bed, terrified I would never walk again." I stepped down from the dais, walking slowly and deliberately until I was standing directly in front of my father. I didn't see a giant anymore. I saw a man who had shriveled to fit the size of his own greed. "You told me that $8,000 was too much of a risk for a failing asset like me. You told me that if I couldn't afford to fix myself, I didn't deserve to be part of your legacy." I took the hospital bill and slapped it against his chest, the paper crinkling under his hand. "Well, consider that debt settled. I've paid for my leg 10 times over with the interest of the trauma you left me with. But I'm a businesswoman now, Marcus, just like you taught me. And in business, every transaction has a conclusion." I reached into my clutch again and pulled out a second document, a heavy legal-grade parchment with a bright red sheriff's seal at the top. "This isn't a medical bill. This is the final eviction and foreclosure notice for the Cascade Heights mansion. Blackwood Acquisitions has officially completed the seizure of all your remaining physical property. As of midnight, you don't just lose your status. You lose the roof over your head." The color drained from Yolanda's face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together. "You can't," she whispered, her voice failing. "That's our home, Keisha. Your grandfather built that house. My grandfather built a home for a family," I countered, my eyes flashing with a cold, righteous fire. "You turned it into a museum for your own vanity. Tomorrow morning, a construction crew will arrive to begin gutting the interior. It's being repurposed as the Dorothy Turner Clinic, a place where people who can't afford surgery will get it for free. Your legacy is being demolished to make room for hers." I looked at the guards and gave a sharp final nod. "Get them out of my sight. I don't want the smell of their desperation ruining the air of my company." Marcus tried to scream, but no sound came out. He just clutched the two papers, the $8,000 bill and the foreclosure notice, as he was dragged into the darkness of the hallway. The doors slammed shut, the heavy thud sounding like a gavel bringing a trial to an end. I stood in the foyer, my head held high, breathing in the first moment of true, unburdened freedom I had ever known. The transaction was complete. The account was closed. Darnell stepped forward to the center of the stage, the bright lights reflecting off his polished watch as he adjusted the microphone. The room, which had been buzzing with the shock of the Marcus family's public eviction, fell into a profound, expectant silence. He didn't look like a man who had just enjoyed a moment of revenge. He looked like a man who was finally finishing a job that should have been done long ago. He stood beside Keisha, his shoulder brushing hers, a silent testament to the bond that had survived the warehouse shifts and the cold studio nights. "Tonight isn't about the downfall of a name," Darnell began, his voice deep and steady, carrying an authority that commanded every billionaire and socialite in the hall. "It's about the birth of a promise." He looked out over the audience, his gaze lingering on the empty space where our parents had just been dragged away. "For too long, the gatekeepers of this city have treated human health like a luxury product and a person's worth like a stock price. We were told that if you don't have the capital to save yourself, you don't deserve to be saved. We were told that $8,000 was the distance between a future and a dead end. He reached out and took the microphone from the stand, walking toward the edge of the stage. We are here to announce that every single cent raised from tonight's auction, every bid on every piece of art, and every dollar donated in this room will not be going into a corporate bank account. It will be funneled directly into the Dorothy Turner Pediatric Surgical Fund. We are establishing a permanent endowment specifically for children from low-income families who are facing the exact same wall my sister faced 2 years ago. We are here for the kids who don't have $8,000. We are here for the families who are being told their child's mobility is a line item they can't afford. A low murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, followed by a slow building wave of applause. Darnell didn't stop. He raised his hand to quiet the room. "This isn't charity," he continued. "This is an investment in the grit and potential of people who are usually left in the rain. If this city is going to move forward, it can't leave its most vulnerable behind because of a hospital bill. From this moment on, no child in this district will be denied a life-altering surgery because their parents can't meet an arbitrary price tag. We are removing the gates. We are tearing down the walls." He turned to me, a look of pure brotherly pride in his eyes. He spoke about how we had learned that the only real wealth is the ability to lift someone else up when the rest of the world is stepping on them. He promised the donors that their names would be etched into the new clinic, not as symbols of status, but as partners in a mission to ensure that no one else has to experience the absolute isolation of being told they aren't worth the cost of their own recovery. The applause was no longer polite, it was thunderous. People stood up, some with tears in their eyes, finally seeing the true weight of the legacy we were building. Darnell had taken the pain of our past and converted it into a shield for the future. He had proven that while Marcus and Yolanda were busy counting their dwindling coins, he was counting the lives he could save. As he stepped back, the digital ticker on the screen behind us began to climb, the numbers spinning rapidly as the elite of Atlanta rushed to put their money where their hearts had finally been awakened. We stood there together, two outcasts who had become the architects of a new kind of mercy. The $8,000 that once felt like a mountain was now the foundation of a sanctuary, and the name Turner was finally synonymous with a love that could never be bought or sold. The crowd had begun to filter out toward the valet station, leaving the grand foyer echoing with the fading sounds of success. I was heading toward the exit with Darnell when a shadow detached itself from the pillars near the heavy oak doors. It was Andre. He didn't look like the Golden Sun anymore. His designer shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His eyes were sunken pits of despair, and his hands were shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. As we approached, his knees hit the marble floor with a dull, hollow thud. He didn't just sit. He collapsed into a kneeling position, his head bowed in a posture of total defeat that I had never seen from him in 30 years. "Keisha, please." He choked out the words, struggling to leave his throat. "I didn't know. I was blind. I followed Dad because I thought that was what being a man meant. I thought being a Marcus meant being untouchable." He looked up at me, tears streaming through the grime on his face. "Tiffany took everything. I have 50 million in debt and nowhere to sleep tonight. I'm your brother. Please don't leave me like this. I'll work for you. I'll clean the floors at your clinic. Just don't let me drown." I stopped and looked down at him, but I didn't feel the surge of pity he was hoping for. I didn't feel anger either. I felt a cold, surgical detachment. I remembered the night of the accident, how Andre had stood by the bar on the yacht swirling a glass of scotch and telling me that my medical bills were an unnecessary drain on the family's liquidity. I remembered him laughing as he told me that life didn't have a safety net for the weak. He was the one who had cheered the loudest when I was cast out, believing that my absence would simply mean a larger share of the inheritance for him. I leaned down slightly, my eyes meeting his. "You aren't sorry because you hurt me, Andre. You're sorry because the person you stepped on turned out to be the only person who could save you. You're not grieving for our family. You're grieving for your credit limit. I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple printed list of local homeless shelters and job training centers, the same ones Darnell and I had scouted during our first month of exile. Darnell stepped beside me. His arms crossed, his gaze hard. You used to say that people in these places were lazy and unfit for the modern economy. Darnell said, his voice dropping like a hammer. Well, now you have a chance to prove yourself wrong. Andre grabbed the hem of my gown, his voice rising into a frantic plea. You can't do this. I'm a Marcus. I don't know how to live like that. I'll die out there. I gently but firmly unpried his fingers from the silk. No, Andre. You won't die. You'll learn. You spent your whole life reaping the rewards of a harvest you didn't plant. Now you're going to learn what it means to actually earn a life. I am not going to give you a job, and I am not going to pay your debt. Responsibility is the only thing that will teach you how to be a human being instead of a brand name. I looked at the security guard and gestured toward the door. Help him up and see him to the gate. He has a lot of walking to do, and I'd hate for him to be late for his first day of reality. Andre began to sob, a loud, ugly sound that filled the foyer, but I didn't look back. I walked through the doors and out into the cool night air, the scent of rain fresh on the breeze. I felt light. I felt clean. As Darnell and I stepped into our car, I realized that the greatest gift I could give my brother wasn't a check, but the same cold, hard ground that had forced me to stand up on my own. The Marcus legacy was a tomb, but the path ahead of us was wide open. I closed the door, and for the first time in my life, the silence was perfect. The camera transitioned smoothly from the cold, rain-slicked harbor back to the warmth of the present-day living room. The setting is vastly different from the tattered apartment of 2 years ago. This space is filled with soft, natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook a bustling community park below. The walls are no longer peeling. They are adorned with vibrant, large-scale canvases, Keisha's own work depicting scenes of resilience growth and the unfiltered beauty of the human spirit. The air is quiet, but it's a peaceful silence filled with the scent of fresh linseed oil and expensive coffee. Keisha is sitting on a modern velvet armchair, her posture relaxed and regal. She wears a simple but elegant linen suit, a stark contrast to the heavy armor-like gowns of the gala. Her left leg is crossed comfortably over her right, showing no signs of the struggle that once defined her every movement. On the side table next to her sits the old mahogany box, polished and preserved, holding a place of honor in her home. Beside it is a framed photo of her and Darnell on the day they opened the clinic, both of them beaming with a joy that money couldn't buy. She leans forward slightly toward the lens, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips. It isn't the smile of a victim who survived, nor is it the smile of a conqueror who took revenge. It is the smile of someone who finally understands the true geometry of the heart. The camera pulls in for a tight close-up, capturing the depth and clarity in her eyes. The hardness from the night at the harbor has melted away, replaced by a profound sense of peace. She has built an empire, but more importantly, she has found her soul. In the background, we hear the faint sound of a door opening and the familiar, cheerful voice of Darnell calling out to her. It's a mundane, everyday sound, but in this house it's a symphony. It's the sound of a family that functions on love rather than leverage. Keisha looks off camera for a split second, her expression softening even further at the sound of her brother's voice, before returning her gaze to the lens. The light in the room begins to dim slowly, the golden hour of the afternoon fading into a gentle twilight. As the frame begins to lose its sharpness, Keisha speaks one final time, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the fading light. There is no bitterness in her tone, only a truth that has been forged in fire and tempered by time. Real family doesn't abandon you when you are in pain. They are the only ones who stay when the rest of the world walks away. The image begins to lose its color, transitioning into a soft, warm sepia, before fading completely to black. The only thing that lingers for a moment longer is the silhouette of the wooden box on the table, a silent witness to a journey from the depths of betrayal to the heights of true belonging. The screen remains dark as the credits begin to roll in silence, leaving the weight of her words to settle in the air. The most profound lesson from this story is that true legacy is not measured by bank balances or social status, but by unwavering loyalty and character. Wealth can be built and lost, but the bond between those who stand by you in your darkest hour is the only currency that never devalues. Keisha and Darnell's journey proves that success is most meaningful when it is used to heal others, turning past trauma into a foundation for community empowerment. Let this story inspire you to build a life defined by compassion. Would you like me to help you outline a new script centered on another powerful life lesson